I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. You know, and I think that's what I sussed when I was 16 and 12, way down the line.
John Lennon built his legacy on peace, love, and revolution, yet managed to inspire pure hatred from some of music's greatest icons. The man who sang "All You Need Is Love" had a talent for making enemies that matched his gift for melody. Behind the round glasses and activist facade lived someone whose hypocrisy, artistic theft, and casual cruelty turned admirers into adversaries. The King's Silent War. When John Lennon walked into Elvis Presley's Bel Air mansion on August 27, 1965, the collision between working-class Southern patriotism and British middle-class rebellion was inevitable. The meeting had been years in the making. The Beatles had desperately wanted to meet their idol since arriving in America. Manager Brian Epstein had been negotiating with Colonel Tom Parker for over a year, navigating the complex protocols required for rock royalty to meet the king. But the moment Lennon spotted the table lamps engraved with "All the Way with LBJ," celebrating President Johnson's Vietnam escalation, any chance of friendship evaporated into the California night. Elvis barely stood to greet them. The television played silently in the corner, a habit that would later remind Lennon of his own compulsive need for background noise. The king sat back down in his red shirt. He owned the same shirt in every color except brown, which he despised, and waited for his guest to speak first. The Beatles, who'd faced screaming crowds of thousands without flinching, found themselves tongue-tied in the presence of the man who'd invented their world. When silence stretched uncomfortably long, Elvis delivered his famous ultimatum: "If you guys are just going to sit there and stare at me, I'm going to bed." The tension broke temporarily when guitars appeared. Elvis had a bass plugged into a massive amplifier, playing along to the silent television, a habit Lennon would later adopt. They jammed on Beatles songs and Elvis classics, Paul McCartney desperately trying to keep things light, George Harrison sneaking off to smoke pot in the garden with members of the Memphis Mafia. But Lennon couldn't resist the provocation that would poison their relationship forever. "What happened to the old rock and roll Elvis?" he asked, half joking but wholly serious. "Why are you just doing movie soundtracks now?" The question cut deeper than Lennon knew. Elvis had been trapped in Hollywood contracts, churning out formulaic films he despised, Harem Scarum, Frankie and Johnny, Paradise Hawaiian Style, watching the Beatles steal his revolutionary thunder with films like A Hard Day's Night that redefined what rock movies could be. Colonel Parker's iron grip had reduced the king to a Vegas-ready caricature of his former self, and here was this British upstart rubbing salt in the wound. Tony Barrow, the Beatles' press officer, described the atmosphere as stilted after Lennon's jab. Elvis forced a laugh and explained that when they departed from the formula, with Wild in the Country, they'd lost money. Play a country boy with a guitar who meets a few gals along the way and sing a few songs," he drawled, the self-mockery barely masking his humiliation. But the damage was done. In Presley's mind, Lennon represented everything threatening about the 1960s. The anti-war movement, the counterculture, the breakdown of respect for American institutions. The true depth of Elvis's resentment wouldn't surface until years later. By 1970, paranoid and pill-addicted despite his anti-drug crusade, Elvis sought a meeting with President Nixon. The December 21st White House encounter remains one of the most surreal moments in American history. Elvis arrived uninvited at the White House gates at 6:30 a.m., wearing a purple velvet cape and carrying a chrome-plated World War II Colt 45 as a gift for the president. During their meeting, photographed by Oliver Atkins in what would become the most requested image in National Archives history, Elvis railed against the Beatles as a real force for anti-American spirit. He claimed they promoted drug culture through their filthy, unkempt appearances and suggestive music, conveniently ignoring his own pharmaceutical dependencies that would require multiple prescriptions from Dr. George Nicopolis, eventually contributing to his death. Elvis told Nixon that the Beatles had been a focal point for anti-American sentiments, and that their influence on American youth was deliberately subversive. He positioned himself as a patriotic alternative, someone who could infiltrate the counterculture and report back to authorities. Most damaging was Elvis's campaign with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to have Lennon deported. When Lennon and Yoko Ono sought permanent U.S. residency while actively protesting Nixon's policies, Elvis saw an opportunity for revenge. He fed Hoover's existing suspicions about Lennon's influence on American youth, contributing to years of government surveillance and legal battles that nearly succeeded in expelling Lennon from the country. The FBI file on Lennon would eventually grow to over 400 pages, documenting his every move, his associates, his planned appearances at anti-war rallies. The irony was crushing. Elvis, who'd learned guitar from black musicians like Arthur Crudup and B.B. King, who'd built his career on rebellion and sexual transgression, had become the establishment's enforcer. Lennon, the middle-class boy from Liverpool's Menlove Avenue, who'd idolized Elvis since hearing Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, had become everything his hero feared. Class, politics, and generational change had transformed admiration into active sabotage. When Elvis died in 1977, Lennon's public statement was respectful but revealing. Elvis died when he went into the Army. The boy who'd once copied Elvis's hair and stance had pronounced his hero spiritually dead years before his body gave out. The folk prophet's revenge. Bob Dylan's relationship with the Beatles began with mutual fascination and ended in calculated humiliation. When they first met in August 1964 at the Delmonico Hotel, Dylan introduced the Beatles to marijuana in a Manhattan hotel room, a moment that would reshape their creative process. Paul McCartney later claimed they played the freewheelin' Bob Dylan nonstop for 3 weeks in Paris. "I'd never heard anything like it," McCartney recalled. "It was all about real things, not, I love you, you love me." Dylan had given them permission to be artists, not just entertainers, but Dylan watched with growing fury as the Beatles absorbed his influence. By 1965's Rubber Soul, the borrowing had become too blatant to ignore. "What is this?" Dylan exploded after hearing the album. "It's me, Bob. He's doing me. Even Sonny and Cher are doing me, but fucking hell, I invented it." The possessiveness revealed Dylan's belief that he owned not just his songs, but his entire mode of expression. The stream of consciousness lyrics, the nasal delivery, the transformation of pop music into personal testimony. Norwegian Wood particularly enraged him. The song's introspective narrative, its acoustic intimacy, its literary ambiguity all bore Dylan's fingerprints. The sitar might have been George Harrison's contribution, but the DNA was pure Dylan. John Lennon had studied the master and produced an impressive forgery. He'd even adopted Dylan's ambiguous pronouns, his unreliable narrator, his ability to make a simple story feel like a psychological novel. Dylan's response was swift and devastating. "Fourth time around." The song was a masterpiece of musical assassination. Dylan took Lennon's melody, his 6/8-time signature, even his romantic narrative structure, then twisted them into a parody so precise it became a funhouse mirror. Where Lennon's narrator in Norwegian Wood maintains cool detachment about a failed seduction, Dylan's protagonist in Fourth Time Around stumbles through drunken confusion and bitter recrimination. The woman in Dylan's song literally throws him out, screams until she falls into a fit while he rifles through her belongings and fills his shoe with unspecified objects. Surreal details that made Lennon's wine and conversation scenario seem quaint. The killing blow came in the final lines. "I never asked for your crutch, now don't ask for mine." The message was unmistakable. Stop using my style as your artistic support system. But Dylan wasn't content with just recording his response. In a move of calculated cruelty, he played Fourth Time Around privately for Lennon before releasing it on Blonde on Blonde. Lennon later described the experience to friends as one of the most uncomfortable moments of his life. Sitting in Dylan's hotel room, listening to what was obviously a direct attack disguised as a song, unable to respond without admitting the theft, forced to smile and pretend appreciation while Dylan watched his reaction with those unblinking eyes. "I was very paranoid about that," Lennon admitted to Rolling Stone in 1968. "I just didn't like what I felt I was feeling. I thought it was an out-and-out skit, but it wasn't. It was wilder." Al Cooper, who played organ on the track, witnessed the complexity of Dylan's game. When Cooper worried the Beatles might sue over the obvious similarity, Dylan claimed he'd played an early version for them before Norwegian Wood existed, that they had actually stolen from him. The timeline was deliberately obscured, the authorship questioned, the influence reversed. Dylan was rewriting history in real time, claiming ownership not just of songs, but of entire artistic movements. The rivalry revealed a fundamental tension in 1960s music: authenticity versus accessibility. Dylan saw himself as channeling ancient traditions through modern consciousness, connecting Woody Guthrie to Rimbaud, Robert Johnson to Blake. Lennon was packaging Dylan's innovations for mass consumption, making the difficult digestible, the obscure obvious. One was a prophet, the other, in Dylan's eyes, was a profitable translator. The resentment would simmer for decades, even as both men occasionally expressed grudging respect for each other's talents. When Lennon died, Dylan's statement was notably brief. John was a great man who transformed the world. The past tense seemed to encompass more than just death. The cynics strike back. While Lennon was crafting Imagine in his Tittenhurst Park mansion, playing a white Steinway grand piano in a white room overlooking 72 acres of manicured grounds, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were developing a musical response that would expose the hollow core of millionaire activism. The mansion itself was a Georgian estate that Lennon had purchased for £150,000 in 1969, featuring medieval gardens, a lake, and servants' quarters. This was where the video for Imagine was filmed, with Yoko opening curtains in their all-white room to let in light, a perfect metaphor for the enlightenment only wealth could buy. Steely Dan's Only a Fool Would Say That, from their 1972 debut, Can't Buy a Thrill, wasn't just criticism, it was surgical deconstruction. The smooth jazz rock arrangement masked lyrics dripping with contempt for Lennon's no possessions philosophy. Fagen's silky delivery made the sarcasm even more cutting. Here was someone living in unimaginable luxury telling working people to imagine having nothing. The song's narrator encounters a man with a face just like a dog, savage but deniable, preaching about a wonderful world where anyone on the street would gladly be your friend. The genius lay in how Steely Dan exposed the class dynamics Lennon ignored. Their song's narrator is explicitly a working man, someone who understands that street-level reality doesn't match penthouse philosophy. When Fagen sang, "I heard it was a dream," the emphasis landed on heard. This wasn't his experience, but something related by those insulated from harsh reality. The wonderful world of universal brotherhood existed only in the imagination of those who never had to test it. Becker later explained their perspective. It's easy to say imagine no possessions when you've got millions in the bank. Try telling that to someone working 3 jobs to pay rent. The duo, known for their cryptic lyrics and jazz sophistication, had delivered one of their most direct statements. They saw through the paradox of wealthy revolutionaries, comfortable radicals, millionaire Marxists who preached redistribution while hoarding wealth. Frank Zappa shared this skepticism, though his criticism came from a different angle. An ardent individualist who distrusted all movements and slogans, Zappa saw Lennon's activism as performative narcissism. "I think John considers himself some sort of a saint," Zappa told an interviewer, "but I haven't seen any miracles yet." During their brief interactions, Zappa was struck by Lennon's need to be seen as important, to be photographed being radical, to have his rebellion documented and distributed. The criticism stung because it contained uncomfortable truths. Lennon himself would later acknowledge the contradiction, admitting to Playboy that Imagine was virtually the Communist Manifesto. Even though he was not particularly communist and certainly not willing to live like one. He owned multiple luxury cars, including a psychedelic Rolls-Royce, fur coats that Yoko would later donate to charity after his death, and properties around the world while singing about no possessions. The Tittenhurst mansion would eventually be sold to Ringo Starr, keeping the wealth within the Beatles' circle. The producer's verdict. Todd Rundgren brought a different perspective to Lennon criticism, that of a fellow musician and producer who understood the machinery of fame. By 1974, Rundgren had established himself as both a successful artist and an innovative producer, working with everyone from the band to the New York Dolls. His technical expertise gave him unique insight into how records were made, how images were constructed, how public personas were manufactured. His Melody Maker interview delivered one of the most devastating assessments of Lennon's post-Beatles career. All he really wants to do is get attention for himself, and if revolution gets him that attention, he'll get attention through revolution. This wasn't the complaint of a jealous competitor. Rundgren was riding high with hits like Hello, It's Me and I Saw the Light, developing a reputation as a studio innovator who would later pioneer music videos and interactive technology. His album Something Anything had demonstrated that a single person could create Beatles-quality pop alone in the studio. His criticism came from watching Lennon's calculated transformation from pop star to revolutionary icon, recognizing the publicity mechanisms at work. Rundgren saw the bed-ins for peace as elaborate photo opportunities, the war is over billboards as expensive self-promotion, the political songs as market positioning. Revolution had been ambiguous enough to please everyone. Power to the people was specific enough to grab headlines. The Toronto Peace Festival, the John Sinclair benefit, the rallies and protests. Rundgren recognized them as carefully orchestrated media events designed to maintain relevance in a post-Beatles world. Lennon's response revealed how accurately Rundgren had struck. "I don't represent anyone but myself. It sounds like I represented something to you, or you wouldn't be so violent towards me." The defensiveness was telling. Lennon tried to flip the criticism back on Rundgren, suggesting the anger revealed more about the accuser than the accused. But he couldn't address the core accusation, that his activism was performance, his revolution a career move, his principles negotiable based on publicity value. The poetess and the patronizer, Joni Mitchell's conflict with Lennon illuminated the gender dynamics that even countercultural icons couldn't escape. By the early 1970s, Mitchell had established herself as one of music's most sophisticated voices. Her album Blue had redefined confessional songwriting, achieving a poetic complexity that influenced generations of artists. Songs like River and A Case of You demonstrated literary sophistication that most rock writers couldn't approach. She painted with words, creating impressionistic portraits that revealed emotional truth through imagery rather than declaration. When Mitchell and Lennon crossed paths at various industry events, Lennon felt compelled to offer unsolicited advice about her music. The exact nature of his critique remains unrecorded, but Mitchell's reaction suggests it was both condescending and ignorant. Here was a man whose lyrics often relied on slogans and simple rhymes. "All you need is love, love, love is all you need," presuming to counsel someone whose words unfolded like Alice Munro stories set to music. Mitchell later revealed her contempt wasn't just personal but philosophical. She saw through Lennon's public persona to the contradictions beneath: the peace activist who had violently struck his first wife Cynthia and emotionally abused his son Julian, the feminist ally who had serially mistreated women throughout his life, the working-class hero who lived like aristocracy. While others worshipped the myth, Mitchell saw the man and found him wanting. He was a faker, Mitchell would later say, though she rarely elaborated publicly out of respect for his death. Friends reported she found his treatment of women particularly hypocritical. This was a man who sang "woman is the N-word of the world," while treating actual women as accessories, distractions, or mothers to replace the one he'd lost. His relationship with Yoko Ono, portrayed as a partnership of equals, often involved him disappearing for drug-fueled weekends while she managed his business affairs. The gender element was inescapable. Lennon felt entitled to critique Mitchell's work uninvited, a presumption he likely wouldn't have made toward Bob Dylan or Neil Young. Mitchell, who'd fought for artistic independence in an industry that wanted to package female artists as either virgins or vamps, recognized the patronizing attitude immediately. She'd already dealt with men who wanted to shape her image, David Crosby, Graham Nash, James Taylor, and wasn't about to accept wisdom from another would-be Svengali, no matter how famous. The theft that revealed everything. The Frank Zappa incident stands apart from other conflicts because it involved demonstrable theft, not of style or influence, but actual composition. When journalist Howard Smith brought Lennon to meet Zappa in June 1971, Zappa was expecting to meet a fellow avant-garde explorer. He knew Lennon had been experimenting with tape loops, backwards recording, and Yoko's conceptual art influence. Instead, Lennon's opening words were, "You're not as ugly as I thought you would be." Despite this inauspicious beginning, Zappa invited Lennon to join the Mothers of Invention on stage at the Fillmore East. The venue was in its final week. Bill Graham would close it forever on June 27th, making any performance there historically significant. The Mothers had been recording their shows for a live album with a full recording truck parked outside. The encore began promisingly with "Well, Baby Please Don't Go," a song Lennon hadn't performed since the Cavern Club days, his voice cracking with genuine emotion as he returned to his rock and roll roots. Then came King Kong, Zappa's composition from 1969's Uncle Meat. This wasn't a loose jam, but a structured piece with specific melodies, bass lines, and arranged sections that the Mothers had been performing for years. Don Preston played a featured keyboard solo while Yoko Ono added her characteristic vocalizations, which actually fit well with Zappa's aesthetic of controlled chaos. The performance lasted over 15 minutes with Zappa conducting dynamics and transitions, clearly leading his composition while accommodating his famous guests. According to their verbal agreement, both artists would have access to the tapes for their own releases. Zappa planned to include the historic collaboration on his Fillmore album. But when Lennon's Sometime in New York City appeared in June 1972, King Kong had been renamed Jam Rag, British slang for a sanitary napkin, and credited entirely to Lennon Ono. No payment, no acknowledgement, not even a footnote mentioning Zappa's existence. The album's inner sleeve showed Lennon's handwritten credits over Zappa's album cover, literally writing Zappa out of his own history. Zappa's public response was remarkably restrained. It was obviously not a jam session song. It's got a melody, it's got a bass line, it's obviously an organized song. Little bit disappointing. That understated disappointing carried more weight than any rage could have. Privately, Zappa was less diplomatic. He told friends that Lennon had acted like a fucking thief, that the theft was so blatant it was insulting. He briefly considered legal action but decided it wasn't worth the publicity nightmare of suing a Beatle. When Zappa finally released his version on 1992's Playground Psychotics, 12 years after Lennon's death, he made several pointed decisions. The track was split into multiple pieces, avoiding the Jam Rag title entirely. His liner notes made no mention of the controversy, letting the music speak for itself. Most tellingly, he included the entire performance, showing how substantial and structured King Kong actually was, impossible to mistake for a spontaneous jam. The incident revealed something essential about Lennon's character. Here was proof that Lennon, for all his talk of peace and love and artistic brotherhood, would steal another artist's work without hesitation. When confronted with the opportunity to take credit for something he didn't create, he took it. No internal conflict, no hesitation, no guilt. The man who railed against music industry exploitation had become exactly what he claimed to oppose. The pattern beneath the piece. These weren't isolated incidents, but a pattern revealing Lennon's fatal flaw, the chasm between his public ideals and private actions. He preached peace while being violent. Cynthia Lennon, May Pang, and others testified to his physical abuse. He promoted love while spreading hatred. His vicious attacks on Paul McCartney in interviews throughout the 1970s shocked even hardened journalists. He demanded honesty while living lies. His heroin addiction, his abandonment of Julian, his tax avoidance schemes, all hidden behind revolutionary rhetoric. Each conflict exposed another layer of hypocrisy. Elvis saw him as a threat to American values while missing the irony that both men were addicted, paranoid, and desperately clinging to relevance. Dylan recognized him as an artistic colonizer, taking authentic expression and packaging it for mass consumption, turning poetry into product. Steely Dan and Rundgren exposed the hollow privilege of his revolutionary poses, the comfortable rebellion of someone insulated from consequences. Mitchell revealed his casual sexism beneath feminist rhetoric, the patronizing attitude that assumed his maleness trumped her genius. Zappa proved he would literally steal from fellow artists while preaching creative brotherhood. That ownership meant nothing when opportunity arose. The tragedy wasn't that Lennon was flawed, all artists are. The tragedy was his messianic self-image that prevented acknowledgement of these flaws while demanding others confront theirs. He positioned himself as a truth-teller while living in denial, as a revolutionary while preserving his own comfort, as a voice for peace while waging personal wars against anyone who challenged him. His famous honesty was selective, applied ruthlessly to others but rarely to himself. Perhaps the most telling moment came during his 1970 Rolling Stone interview when he declared, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me." The honesty was refreshing but also revealing. Behind all the activism and artistry, the collaborations and conflicts, was a man who ultimately believed only in himself. His enemies understood this before his fans did. They recognized the narcissism beneath the idealism, the ego beneath the activism, the conventional ambitious man beneath the revolutionary pose. Modern reassessment of Lennon requires holding these contradictions in balance. His music remains powerful. Strawberry Fields Forever. In My Life, Across the Universe are undeniable achievements. His influence on popular culture, on the very idea that rock stars could be intellectuals and activists, changed history. But the hatred he inspired from fellow artists wasn't jealousy or misunderstanding, it was recognition. They saw through the myth to the man, and what they found there was someone who would betray every principle he claimed to hold sacred for advantage, attention, or simple convenience. When Mark David Chapman killed Lennon on December 8, 1980, he transformed a complex, contradictory human into a simplified martyr. The canonization that followed erased the very flaws that made Lennon interesting, replacing a real person with a plaster saint. But his enemies remembered the real John Lennon, brilliant and cruel, revolutionary and reactionary, truthful and deceptive. Their hatred wasn't for his music or even his fame. It was for the gap between who he claimed to be and who he actually was. A gap so wide that 6 of music's greatest talents could fall through it and never forgive him for the deception. What do you think? Did these music legends have legitimate grievances against John Lennon, or were they simply unable to understand his complex legacy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more untold stories from the world of fame, film, and everything in between. See you in the next one.